On a fateful morning in December 1941, the world was about to change forever. The mastermind behind one of the most devastating attacks in military history was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who understood the might of the United States like few others. But what led this brilliant strategist to orchestrate such a risky move against a giant that had the power to destroy Japan's empire? Content. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's life and career were deeply influenced by his early years in Japan's military system. Born on April 4, 1884, in Nagaoka, Japan, into a samurai family, Yamamoto was steeped in the traditions of Japan's warrior culture. However, his path would take a distinct turn when, at the age of 16, he entered the Imperial Japanese Navy Academy, beginning a life that would eventually make him one of Japan's most revered naval leaders. Yamamoto's time studying abroad in the United States at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921 had a profound impact on his worldview. Not only did he gain an understanding of Western thought and technology, but he also developed a keen awareness of the strength of the United States. Yamamoto was fluent in English and spent time in Washington, D.C., gaining insight into American culture and military capabilities. This exposure would later influence many of his strategic decisions, especially his approach to the United States. Upon returning to Japan, Yamamoto quickly rose through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was known for his intellectual approach to warfare, his appreciation for technology, and his emphasis on innovation. By the late 1930s, Japan's aggressive expansionism in China and the Pacific was causing rising tensions with Western powers, especially the United States. Despite Japan's growing militarism, Yamamoto was cautious about directly confronting America. He feared Japan's potential inability to sustain a prolonged conflict against the much larger U.S. economy and military forces. However, as tensions between Japan and the United States escalated, particularly over Japan's invasion of China and its growing dependence on foreign resources, Yamamoto reluctantly accepted that war might become inevitable. Despite his reservations, he understood that Japan's strategic options were limited. In a meeting with his superiors in 1940, he proposed the need for a surprise attack against the U.S. Pacific Fleet, aimed at crippling the American military's ability to fight back effectively. This would give Japan time to secure its imperial ambitions in the Pacific and fortify its territorial holdings. It was Yamamoto's knowledge of American power, particularly the Pacific Fleet, that led him to propose an audacious plan, the attack on Pearl Harbor. He calculated that a sudden strike against the U.S. naval base in Hawaii would neutralize the Pacific Fleet and buy Japan crucial time to expand its empire and consolidate resources. He realized that time was of the essence, and Japan's expansionist goals could only be achieved if they could neutralize American opposition before the U.S. could fully mobilize its industrial and military strength. However, despite being the architect of the attack, Yamamoto was ambivalent about it. His belief in the need for a decisive victory was clear, but so were his doubts. He famously remarked to his superiors, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." Yamamoto knew that while the attack could be successful in the short term, Japan's chances of victory in a prolonged war with the United States were slim. He also feared that the attack might provoke a far stronger American resolve than Japan could handle. Nevertheless, Yamamoto's leadership in the planning of the attack on Pearl Harbor was unwavering. He played an instrumental role in the logistics and coordination of the strike, ensuring that it would be a surprise attack with maximum destruction aimed at disabling the key assets of the Pacific Fleet. His role as the planner of this bold operation solidified his place in history, though it would later become a tragic chapter in his career, as it ultimately led to the downfall of Japan's imperial dreams. As we turn to the next chapter, we will explore the day of the attack itself, which would become one of the most significant moments in world history. December 7, 1941, the day of infamy. Hook. It was a Sunday morning, quiet and serene, when disaster struck. By the time the sun set, thousands of lives had been lost, and the fate of the Pacific would be forever altered. This is the story of Pearl Harbor, a day that President Franklin D. Roosevelt would call a day of infamy. The morning of December 7, 1941, began innocuously enough at the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The base was home to the Pacific Fleet, a sprawling military complex where thousands of sailors, soldiers, and civilians went about their daily routines. At 7:48 a.m. local time, the first wave of Japanese bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes began their assault on Pearl Harbor. Over 350 aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers located 230 miles north of the island. The Japanese attack was coordinated with precision, targeting key military assets, including battleships, aircraft, and military airfields. The surprise element was crucial. Most of the American personnel were unprepared, and radar stations had missed the incoming threat. The first bombs hit just as many sailors were still in their bunks, and by the time the attack ended nearly 2 hours later, the damage was catastrophic. The most famous and devastating blow came when a bomb exploded on the USS Arizona, causing the ship to sink rapidly and kill over 100 of its crew members. The attack also crippled the USS Oklahoma, which capsized and severely damaged other battleships, including the USS West Virginia and the USS California. By the end of the first wave of the attack, the Japanese had effectively neutralized the Pacific Fleet's main fighting power. The U.S. was caught off guard, and the military response was slow. The second wave of Japanese planes followed shortly after, further devastating the American defenses. In addition to the destruction of battleships, American aircraft on the ground were destroyed in large numbers, and vital military infrastructure was decimated. At the conclusion of the attack, 403 Americans were killed, with another 178 wounded. The attack left Pearl Harbor in ruins, and it marked the beginning of open warfare between the United States and Japan. Although the Japanese managed to destroy or damage a large portion of the Pacific Fleet, they made one crucial mistake. They did not target the U.S. aircraft carriers, which were not in port at the time. This oversight would prove to be a fatal one for Japan. In the wake of the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The next day, the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan, officially bringing the United States into World War II. The shock of the attack galvanized the American public, and in the months that followed, the United States would shift into high gear, mobilizing its resources for a total war effort. As we move into the next chapter, we will look at the strategic consequences of the attack and the rise of American counteroffensives that would lead to Japan's eventual defeat. Victory was within Japan's grasp, or so it seemed, but Yamamoto, despite his brilliance, had underestimated the resilience of the United States. What followed was a series of strategic miscalculations that would slowly unravel Japan's hold on the Pacific. Content. In the immediate aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed poised to dominate the Pacific. The surprise attack had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, leaving the United States with no immediate capacity to retaliate. Japan quickly expanded its territorial holdings in Southeast Asia, capturing the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, and other strategic locations, thereby securing vital resources like oil, rubber, and tin. Yamamoto, having initially achieved his goal of neutralizing the U.S. Navy's strength, knew that Japan's window of opportunity was closing. Japan's success hinged on maintaining momentum and forcing the United States into a negotiated peace. Yamamoto's strategy was to keep the U.S. Navy on the defensive, buying time for Japan to fortify its holdings in the Pacific. He also envisioned a quick series of battles that would cripple American forces in the region. However, Yamamoto miscalculated in several key areas. He underestimated the speed at which the United States would mobilize its forces. Yamamoto believed that Japan had at least 6 months to secure its position before America could fully respond. Yet, even in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the United States began to rebuild and refocus its efforts on defeating Japan. The most significant early counteroffensive came in Midway, a small island strategically located between the U.S. and Japan. Yamamoto, seeking to eliminate the remaining threat of American aircraft carriers, launched a major assault on Midway Island in June 1942. However, his overconfidence and lack of intelligence led to disastrous consequences. U.S. cryptographers had broken Japan's naval codes, allowing American forces to anticipate the attack. The Battle of Midway was a turning point in the war. The United States destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and Japan's naval power was severely diminished. Yamamoto's strategic mistake at Midway signaled the beginning of Japan's decline. The Japanese Navy was unable to replace its losses, and Japan's imperial ambitions in the Pacific were increasingly threatened by American forces. The fall of Yamamoto, a strategic vision unraveled. He was once hailed as the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, but in the end, the man who knew the U.S. better than anyone was brought down by the very forces he had sought to avoid. The death of Admiral Yamamoto marked the end of Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific. Content. By 1943, the tide of war had shifted irreversibly against Japan. The early successes that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had envisioned in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor seemed distant memories. His strategic foresight, which had initially earned him acclaim as one of the most brilliant naval commanders of his time, was beginning to unravel under the relentless advance of American forces. While Yamamoto had orchestrated Japan's early military successes, his strategy would ultimately prove to be flawed, and his leadership could not prevent Japan's inevitable defeat. After the devastating loss at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Japanese Navy was never the same. Midway had been a critical moment in the Pacific War. It was more than just a military defeat. It was a blow to the entire Japanese naval strategy. Yamamoto's plan to eliminate the United States aircraft carriers, which he viewed as the greatest threat to Japan's dominance in the Pacific, had backfired. In a brilliant yet tragic stroke of irony, the United States had decoded Japanese naval communications in time to anticipate and prepare for the attack. As a result, the Japanese lost 4 of their aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crippling their offensive capabilities. Yamamoto, once confident in his strategy, was now facing the bitter reality that Japan's future in the Pacific was deeply uncertain. The loss of the carriers was a fatal blow to Japan's ability to project power. Yamamoto, who had advocated for bold action to secure Japan's empire, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of attempting to keep a faltering navy afloat. The defeat at Midway revealed critical flaws in Japan's ability to wage war over the long term, especially given the sheer industrial and technological superiority of the United States. In contrast to the Japanese military, which was resource-constrained and overstretched, the U.S. military had vast production capacity and an ability to replenish and reinforce its forces at a staggering pace. But even after the loss at Midway, Yamamoto was determined to maintain Japan's fighting spirit. He personally oversaw several operations, including the Solomon Islands campaign and the attempt to push back the Allied forces from Papua New Guinea. Despite his determination, these operations increasingly put Japan on the defensive. While Yamamoto's tactical brilliance continued to shine, his overall strategy seemed to falter under the weight of reality. The longer the war dragged on, the more the U.S. military adapted and overcame Japan's early advantages. By 1943, Yamamoto's own government and military leaders were becoming disillusioned with his plans. There was a growing sense of urgency to bring the war to a successful conclusion, but Japan's war objectives were becoming increasingly unrealistic. The strategic situation had fundamentally shifted. The U.S. Navy was rebuilding quickly, its aircraft carriers were the backbone of its power projection, and American industry was capable of producing war materials at a pace Japan could not match. Yamamoto, a man who had once envisioned quick and decisive victories to secure Japan's place in the Pacific, now found himself facing a protracted, unwinnable war. His plans for a decisive victory were crumbling. In the final year of his life, he was tasked with overseeing operations to defend Japan's Pacific holdings, but these operations were becoming increasingly desperate and ineffective. His forces were overextended, and Japan's naval capabilities were stretched thin as they faced a relentless series of U.S. offensives. Yamamoto's eventual death on April 18, 1943, marked the tragic culmination of his career. The circumstances surrounding his death were not by accident. U.S. intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications detailing his travel itinerary. The U.S. had cracked the Purple Code, Japan's diplomatic cipher, which gave them access to vital military information, including Yamamoto's flight plan. The Americans knew that Yamamoto was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect his forces in the Solomon Islands. The U.S. responded with a daring operation known as Operation Vengeance. A squadron of P-38 Lightning fighter planes was dispatched to intercept and eliminate Yamamoto. The American pilots knew the mission was critical, not just to take out a key military leader, but also to deal a psychological blow to the Japanese war effort. They successfully ambushed Yamamoto's plane and shot it down over the Solomon Islands.